I deal with some pretty horrible crimes on this channel, and in doing so, I come across some of the most terrible people in society who commit them. But once in a while, a case comes along where, in my opinion, the criminal involved personifies pure evil. The story I'm about to relate is about a person just like that. Thankfully, due to receiving 2 whole life sentences, they will die behind bars. This is the story of Levi Bellfield. Levi Roberts came into the world on the 17th of May 1968 at West Middlesex Hospital in Isleworth, a modest corner of southwest London. He was the 4th of 5 children born to a lady called Jean Roberts. She was a woman of Romany descent, and she carried the resilience and suspicion of a people long treated as outsiders. Levi's father was Joseph Bellfield, a local mechanic whose rough hands and steady presence anchored the family. For the first decade of Levi's life, the household was noisy and ordinary, and it just about held together. But the balance shattered when Joseph succumbed to leukemia and passed away. Levi was just 10 years old, which was old enough for him to feel the absence, but too young to understand the long shadow it would eventually cast. The death left the Roberts home drifting without its centre of gravity. Jean, who by nature was strong-willed and protective, became the single point of authority, but she was also the main point of comfort as well. Levi clung to his mother with an intensity that went beyond the closeness of a normal grieving child. Psychologists who later studied him would describe how, in the absence of his father, his mother's indulgence became absolute. He was never properly chastised, never held accountable for any wrongdoings, and he was never told no in a way that stuck. Jean doted on him, excusing his temper and defending his actions. That lack of boundaries bred entitlement, and that entitlement hardened into the belief that rules did not apply to him. Even as an adult locked behind prison bars, Levi would telephone and visit his mother, and he did this with a devotion that struck investigators as almost unnatural. He never fully cut the cord. School life did nothing to smooth his rough edges. He began at Forge Lane, moved on to Rectory, and eventually Feltham Comprehensive. In all 3, he left behind the same impression, and that was of a boy who slipped through the cracks. He was physically unremarkable and very slight of frame, and he lacked the swagger and strength that seemed so important to adolescent boys in the late 1970s. The children around him noticed. They ridiculed his high-pitched voice and mocked his wiry frame, and because of this, he was labelled weak. In the playground pecking order, Levi was never anywhere near the top, and these humiliations festered. Each sneer and shove added to the reservoir of resentment that he would carry into adulthood. And once he was an adult, he would overcompensate with boasts of sexual conquests and shows of violent bravado. Truancy became his escape. Instead of enduring the jeers of classmates and the absolute indifference of his teachers, he vanished. Whole days would go missing, swallowed up by a place called Hounslow Heath. Now, this was a stretch of wild ground, just a short walk from his school. For him, the heath was a place of secrecy, of sprawling paths and hidden clearings. It was a perfect refuge for a boy who preferred solitude. He would wander there for hours, alone with his thoughts and nursing his bitterness. And then, in June 1980, the heath ceased to be just a childhood hideout. Patricia, or Patsy Morris, 14 years old, blonde and bright, disappeared from school one afternoon. Hours later, she was found strangled to death in the long grass of Hounslow Heath. Patsy had been one of Levi's classmates at Feltham Comprehensive. Some even suggested they had dated briefly in the clumsy way of teenagers of their age. Levi was 12 at the time, often playing truant in the very area where Patsy's body was found. Police did interview Levi, but no charges were ever brought against him. Officially, there was no evidence whatsoever to tie him to the killing. But unofficially, suspicion lingered. Detectives looking back decades later could not help but see the haunting symmetry. A bullied, slight boy with a growing bitterness towards women, and a murdered blonde girl lying in the very place that he treated as his own private kingdom. Whether or not he was involved, Patsy's death became a grim milestone in Levi's psychological development. Experts would later say that they thought the murder etched something into his imagination, an association between blonde women, vulnerability, and domination. This was something that never left him. His first actual conviction was as a child in 1981, and this was for burglary. He was then convicted of assaulting a police officer in 1990, and he also received convictions for theft and driving offences. By 2002, he'd had a total of 9 convictions, and for these he'd spent almost a year in prison. And through all of this, the bond with his mother remained unbroken. In fact, it was almost smothering. Jean was his defender, his confidant, and his unwavering ally. He turned to her with his troubles and leaned heavily on her indulgence. Disturbingly, she was still wiping his bottom at 12 years of age. Levi absorbed from her the dangerous belief that he could do absolutely no wrong. He slept in his mother's bed throughout his teens, and according to one of Levi's girlfriends, this practice actually continued up until he was aged 30. The connection was so consuming that even decades later, when Levi was branded as a serial killer and locked away, he still called her daily, clung to her approval, and sought her forgiveness. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. To criminologists, it looked like the roots of warped masculinity. This was a boy who grew up demanding love on his own terms, and who later punished women who refused to give it. And as an adult, his relationships all followed the same harrowing pattern. A man called Peter Rodriguez knew Levi Bellfield. The friendship started the way a lot of normal friendships do. Shared laughs, borrowed smokes, someone to call when the car wouldn't start. Now, Levi could be easy company when he wanted to be. He was big on banter, he was forever promising favours. He was the kind of bloke that could make you feel like you were actually something, and that was the hook. But the switch came later. Over time, Pete learned what others would say too. Levi lived on a hair trigger. There was the bright, jokey version, the kind of guy that introduced you around, one that slapped your shoulder and made you feel looked after. And then there was the sudden drop, the shuttered eyes and the silence that meant danger. Pete saw that gap close once, not in rumours or reports, but at arm's length. The charm snapped and words hardened, and what followed was an out-and-out attack. At the time, Pete was living with Levi, but he was becoming increasingly concerned about the level of chaos and violence that surrounded the man. Bellfield's partner, Jo, would later recount her version of events. She would state that she'd been on the telephone with Pete, and he came across as being very guarded in his answers when she was asking about Levi. He basically just gave yes or no blunt answers to her questions. It was as if he was being listened in on, which in fact he was. And that was a feeling that was all too familiar to Jo. She'd been through it herself. The culmination of this call saw Pete attacked by Bellfield. And as he fled, he was pursued down the corridor and hit repeatedly with a hammer. This resulted in life-threatening injuries and an extended stay in hospital. Luckily, Pete survived the physical ordeal, but the mental cost was severe. The attack was brief, explosive, and personal, and ended with Pete no longer seeing a friend, but recognizing a predator, who turned on people he knew as easily as he would turn on strangers. Bellfield's working life gave him opportunities to enact his fantasies. He drifted through jobs that relied on aggression, presence, and anonymity. These were roles where a heavy hand was much more valuable than skill. As a nightclub bouncer across West London, he stood at doors where young women queued. He watched them pass, and he learned how to exploit their vulnerability. Later, running a wheel clamping business in West Drayton, he found a way to exert power in an everyday setting. He decided who could move, he decided who was trapped and who was forced to pay. It was a microcosm of the control that he craved throughout his life. To outsiders, he was the joker, the man who always had a story. He was the neighbour who offered to fix your car or have a drink with you. But to the women inside his orbit, he was a tightening noose. He was a man who demanded absolute control and who punished any sort of defiance with violence. An example of this is the fact that he usually confiscated their mobile phones and then gave them a replacement which only contained his number. He told them, that's the only number you'll ever need. And the violence always escalated with a terrifying rhythm, moving from fantasy to compulsion. In the dark corners of local nightclubs, Levi's violence and predatory nature became clearer. On one occasion, he was reported to have offered Rohypnol, the so-called date rape drug, to a young woman. He then attacked her while she was incapacitated. When the woman's mother phoned her mobile phone later, Levi answered it with chilling nonchalance. He actually boasted to the mother of what he'd done. Those who worked with him did sometimes catch glimpses of the monster behind the mask. One former employee, disturbed by what he'd seen, described Levi in blunt terms: an animal and a caveman. There was no affection in those words, only a reflection of the primitive brutality that defined his interactions with the world. And behind closed doors, his private life mirrored the chaos of his predatory working persona. Levi fathered 11 children by 5 different women, leaving a tangled legacy of fractured relationships, broken trust, and children raised in the shadow of violence. For most of the women, the relationship would begin with charm. He could be funny, generous, and in most cases even attentive. But the facade never lasted. It always gave way to manipulation, possessiveness, domination, and unpredictable cruelty. He even used his children to help him commit crimes. Bobby Louise Bellfield, his oldest child, recounts details of crimes, burglaries, and violence. He used her specifically for cover while he dealt drugs. He would use her to hide his marijuana stash from the police, and he once kept her in his burglary getaway vehicle. She remembered the way he treated schoolgirls too. She said he was always beeping at girls who were walking down the street. He'd shout things like "oi oi" and things like that. His van was a familiar sight in the neighbourhood, and it became his true hunting tool of choice. He prowled the streets at night, deliberately circling bus stops. He also prowled down quiet lanes. Inside the vehicle he kept a small arsenal: a baseball bat, a mattress, and blankets. But these were not the items of an honest tradesman. They were the carefully considered and prepared tools of a predator. They were objects for intimidation, coercion, and, if necessary, abduction. Witnesses described seeing him follow young girls, usually blondes. He could transform a normal walk down a suburban street into a moment of terror. One of Levi's girlfriends, Joanna Collins, who was known within police files and in later media accounts, stood once as both companion and witness to the man who would become Britain's infamous bus stop killer. They'd met in the mid-1990s while Levi was working on the door at Rocky's nightclub in Cobham. At this time, Jo was still grappling with the grief surrounding her father's death. He moved in with her and her mother in a place called Strawberry Hill in Twickenham. And after this, Jo quickly became pregnant. At first, he was tender and caring, the attentive boyfriend that Jo thought she needed. But as time passed, the charm soured. Levi became totally controlling. He began checking her phone incessantly. He monitored calls with a gaze that would stifle her voice. And he was gradually but systematically isolating her from her friends. On top of this, he demanded to know where she was every single hour of the day. He watched her while she bathed and invaded most of her private moments, even like being on the toilet. And sometimes he would make her sleep naked on the floor. He dictated her clothing, her conversations. Bit by bit, he stripped her of any autonomy. The criminologists described this as textbook coercive control. They said it was evidence of how quickly power can corrupt purported love. When she resisted, he abruptly escalated into psychological torture, and this was often accompanied by extreme violence. Collins would later say that He raped me and beat me up. She said the violence would turn from psychological to physical in the blink of an eye. Her one reprieve was her love of horses. Now, this was a sanctuary for her that Levi, for some reason, never touched. And so she was always glad when he left the house. And Jo would later say that she always felt relief mixed with guilt when she knew he was with other women. She felt relief because she had a reprieve from his cruelty, but also guilt because she couldn't shake the feeling that another woman might be suffering in her place. But she was too terrified of Levi to do anything about it. Over time, Jo spotted the warning signs that she had once ignored. In 1996, while she was sorting through some boxes of old stuff in her garage, she found a mutilated fashion magazine. She said the faces of all the blonde women in the magazine had been stabbed. When she asked him about the magazine, he said, and this is a direct quote from him, "All blondes are slags and deserve to die." The symbology wasn't hidden or open to mistake. It was his angriest, most obsessive rage, transferred physically onto paper. Now, this brought it home to her that he wasn't just abusive, he was completely unbalanced. And by 1997, pregnant again, this time with their son, Jo made a harrowing decision. She forced herself to leave him. It was terrifying, yet absolutely necessary. But Levi's hold did not end there. He stalked her relentlessly. She sought legal protection, but the injunction only escalated his fury. "Even when I managed to leave him and get legal help, he still stalked me," she would later reflect. He haunted her doorways, he would drive past her home, and he turned what independence she had into a complete nightmare. He phoned for pizzas countless times to be delivered to her property. And on multiple occasions he sent taxis to her home when she didn't want them. Even though they were separated, he was still managing to terrify her. Now, although he lacked the looks or the charisma that usually drew women in, Levi carried himself with the swagger of someone who thought he was irresistible. He thought of himself as a ladies' man, a title that he claimed loudly and often. He would regularly boast to friends or acquaintances about conquests that were either exaggerated or completely invented. His confidence wasn't rooted in genuine charm, it was rooted in manipulation. He would also add coercion and intimidation into the mix. What he could not win through affection, he took through control and often by force. For Joanna, the shift was devastating. Other partners told similar stories. Levi's pattern was frighteningly consistent. It would start with early warmth and charm that made him appear safe, but this would then be followed by the possessiveness, the cruelty, and the manipulation. One of his previous girlfriends said that following an argument, he made her sit on a stool in the kitchen. He told her not to move and to stay there all night, and he then went off to bed. One of the police officers, Detective Sergeant Brunt, said, "We asked her, what did you do about going to the toilet? And she said she would rather have wet herself than have moved from that stool." Now, that shows how frightened they were of him. Jo and Bellfield were in a relationship for about 3 or 4 years before he went on to meet his long-term girlfriend, Emma Mills. Now, Emma and Bellfield met in 1996 when she was only about 17 or 18, and she quickly became obsessed with him. She liked his cheeky chappy personality, and the fact that he always left flowers and little notes for her. This probably made her feel good, and being such a young girl, she was quite easily flattered. After 6 months of dating, Emma moved in with Bellfield. But after a few weeks, he started regularly beating and raping her. Despite this, they had 2 children together before splitting up. And when they did split up, Emma went to stay in a woman's refuge. This was something that Emma's mother was thankful for because she never did like Bellfield. However, a few months later, she was horrified to learn that not only had Emma left the refuge and moved back in with Bellfield, they were also expecting their 3rd child together. Apparently, Bellfield had made Emma many, many promises. Following their fresh start, Bellfield seemed to keep his word, and he didn't lay a finger on Emma again. And then, in March 2002, schoolgirl Milly Dowler, aged 13, went missing not far from the couple's flat. Now, the week Milly vanished, the couple were house-sitting for a friend in West London. Now, Levi was out and he returned to the friend's flat at around about 10 or 11 that night. But when he returned, Emma noticed that he was wearing different clothes to those he was wearing that morning. She later said, "I would never get a straight answer. And even if he did tell me something, I would never know if it was the truth." Now, when the pair returned home to Collingwood Place the following day, Mills noticed something unusual in the bedroom. She said there were no sheets or pillowcases on the bed. There was also no duvet cover either, so she rang him to find out what had gone on. He told her that the dog had had an accident on the bed, but Emma didn't believe him. She said, "Why would she do that? When did it happen?" He replied that he'd put the sheets in the rubbish because they just couldn't be washed. Mills said that Bellfield's Staffordshire Bull Terrier would never have soiled the bed. The dog was called Shy. And when she looked in the bins outside the flat, she could see no sign of the sheets, pillowcases, or anything like it. But his lies and violence were about to shatter the tranquility of this local community, making headlines that shook them to the core. Milly Dowler disappeared on the 21st of March 2002 after leaving Walton-on-Thames railway station to walk home along Station Avenue in Surrey. Station Avenue was near Bellfield's home in Collingwood Place. Amélie had just called her father to say that she was on her way home, but she never arrived. The disappearance sparked a frantic search. Posters with Milly's smiling face appeared on lampposts. Television appeals went out nightly. And her parents, Sally and Bob, stood before cameras pleading for their daughter's safe return. The nation held its breath, willing for a miracle. Nearly 6 months later, in Yateley Heath Woods, the discovery of Milly Dowler's body marked a devastating turn in the investigation. And the quiet patch of woodland where her remains were found was immediately sealed off. Experts began the painstaking process of piecing together what had happened. Based on dental records, they would state that the remains were almost certainly Milly's. Between 30 and 40 officers combed through the dense vegetation. They were assisted by victim recovery dogs, trying to find clues as to when she'd actually died. Beyond the forest, police widened their efforts. They appealed to the public for sightings of 4 vehicles, among them a white box van. These vehicles had been seen in the area around about the time that Milly had vanished. Officers knocked on doors, spoke to locals, and even questioned military personnel who were stationed at a nearby barracks. Every possible lead mattered. The search for Milly had gripped the country long before her remains were found. Back in September 2002, police had released enhanced CCTV footage. This appeared to show Milly talking to the driver of a saloon car. That footage became a central focus of the inquiry. From the very beginning, Surrey police had launched Operation Ruby, a massive investigation into Milly's disappearance. Police carried out 3,500 house-to-house inquiries. It's the biggest investigation the force has ever made. At a cost of £6 million, 100 extra officers were drafted in. 350 different sites were searched, including 40 underwater locations, and 35 miles of waterways were also searched. They also checked out 73 reported sightings both in the UK and abroad. They noted 256 people of potential interest in the local area. This included 50 registered sex offenders. But no one raised Bellfield as a suspect at that time. Police vehicles patrolled the streets of Walton-on-Thames and the surrounding area. It was a reminder to the public that the search was very much still alive. As the investigation deepened, attention turned to the flat at Collingwood Place. This was the home of Levi Bellfield and his partner Emma Mills. What police would later uncover raised chilling questions. Just a few days after Milly had vanished, Bellfield was seen removing a mattress and other personal items from the flat with a friend. Although their tenancy had not yet expired, Levi and Emma had decided, it seems, to move out. Police had attempted to contact Bellfield at that address at least 10 times, but they'd never been able to get hold of him. They were later criticised for not contacting his landlord. Inquiries were described as extensive but not exhaustive. But Assistant Chief Constable Jerry Kirkby did acknowledge that they should have been more exhaustive. But even if Bellfield himself had answered the door, there was nothing to suggest him as a suspect, said Kirkby. And by the time investigators were able to examine the flat, it had been redecorated. Any traces of anything that had been there in March 2002 had been wiped away. In hindsight, these details painted a disturbing picture. At the time, though, police were working against the clock, sifting through forests, searching streets and homes, desperate to piece together the truth about what had happened to Milly. When Milly's disappearance became headline news, Jo Collins watched from a distance. But she recognised patterns that no one else did. She saw the white people carrier described in the media, and it struck closer than she wanted to admit. It wasn't until later that she phoned the police. "I think it's him," she said, linking Levi to the chilling crime. Jo carried a crushing burden of what-ifs. In a rare moment of public heartbreak, she said that she regretted not going to the police sooner. "I'll have to live with the guilt for the rest of my life," she admitted. But Bellfield continued his predatory life, stalking women around London. He attacked them with hammers and ran them down with his van. On the night of the 4th of February 2003, 19-year-old Marsha McDonnell was returning home after a night out with friends. She got off a number 111 bus in a place called Hampton. Well, this was thought of as a safe, tree-lined suburb where parents felt comfortable letting their lone daughters walk the short distance home. As she walked down the quiet street a few yards from her house, Levi Bellfield ambushed her. With a blunt instrument believed later to be a hammer, he struck her viciously on the back of the head. There was no robbery and no sexual assault. The attack was swift, brutal, and seemingly motiveless. Marsha collapsed in the road unconscious. She survived long enough to be rushed to hospital, but 2 days later her family's worst fears were realised. Marsha succumbed to her injuries and sadly passed away. The community was stunned. Here was a young woman, bright, popular, on the cusp of adulthood, cut down in a way that seemed senseless. For detectives, the lack of motive was completely chilling, and for Levi, cold and calculating, the first order of business was not guilt or remorse, it was concealment. Just days after Marsha's murder, he sold his Vauxhall Corsa, the very car tied to his movements that night. It was as if ridding himself of the vehicle could erase the memory of what he'd done that night. Had it been known that he sold it for just £1,500, having purchased it just a few months earlier for £6,000, then alarm bells might have rung. A year later, in May 2004, Levi struck again, this time with an even more brazen display of cruelty. 18-year-old Kate Sheedy was walking home late at night in Isleworth. She had deliberately crossed to the far side of the road to avoid a white people carrier that appeared to be circling in the area. Her instincts were right. This particular vehicle belonged to Bellfield. As she stepped onto the pavement, he mounted the curb and drove straight at her. He ran her down, not once, but twice. The crushing weight of the van shattered her pelvis, collapsed a lung, and left her broken body in the road. But somehow, Kate clung to life. Through the haze of agony, she fumbled for her mobile phone and managed to call her mother.
Where does it hurt?
Everywhere.
So he went over you twice?
Yeah. And I really hurt.
But against the odds, Kate survived. Her courage and her memory of the vehicle that had tried to kill her would later prove pivotal in connecting Bellfield to the crimes. Just 3 months later, on the 19th of August 2004, another young life was stolen. Amélie Delagrange, a 22-year-old French exchange student, missed her bus after a night out with friends. Like Marsha before, she walked across Twickenham Green, an area that locals regarded as safe, even idyllic. But Levi was there, lurking, prowling the streets in his van. Spotting Amélie, blonde, vulnerable, and alone, he seized the opportunity. He struck her down with the same cold efficiency he'd used on Marsha. A passerby found her lying gravely injured on the grass, and again, sadly, she died in hospital shortly after. It later transpired that Emma had called Bellfield the night he killed the French student, asking him to go to Tesco to pick up some milk that she'd forgotten to buy. But the call had gone to his voicemail, transmitting to a phone mast covering the site of the murder. It placed the bouncer at the scene of the crime, and Emma's Tesco receipt was also used as further evidence to cage him. By now, police realised they were dealing with something far beyond isolated acts of violence. The attacks bore all the hallmarks of a single serial predator. Women, often young blondes, attacked late at night near bus routes, bludgeoned or run down without any theft or sexual assault. The head of the investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, felt that the answer lay in CCTV. And so detectives began combing through recordings, poring over thousands of hours of grainy footage from both buses and street cameras. It was laborious work, but eventually a breakthrough came. Footage showed a man loitering near a bus stop not far from where Amélie was murdered. He matched the description of Bellfield, and crucially a white van consistent with Bellfield's was seen again and again at key locations. On the 22nd of November 2004, the net closed. Police finally arrested Levi Bellfield at his West Drayton home. The evidence was pieced together. His vehicles, his movements, his violent history. Throughout the investigation, his overt arrogance would manifest itself in what police would term a series of no-comment interviews. Levi basically refused to answer any of their questions. He also wouldn't admit any responsibility for any of the crimes. In February 2008, after a long and harrowing trial, justice caught up with him. He was convicted of murdering Marsha McDonnell and Amélie Delagrange, and for the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. For these crimes, he received life imprisonment with a whole life order. It was the first of two. It was a punishment that ensured that this predator, who had turned ordinary suburban bus stops into hunting grounds, would never walk free again. It was only after his 2008 convictions for those later crimes that detectives began to reconsider previous events. The similarities in methods, the timelines, and the geography brought them back to Walton-on-Thames. And when they mapped his addresses against Milly's route home, the connection was impossible to ignore. Bellfield had lived almost on top of the abduction site. Witnesses remembered seeing his car, and his own partner recalled his behaviour on that day. Agitated, absent, inexplicable. Slowly a case was built. In March 2010, he was charged with Milly Dowler's murder. The trial the following year was again harrowing. The Dowler family endured not only the reliving of Milly's final hours, but also invasive cross-examination about Milly's private life. This ordeal provoked national outrage about how victims' families are treated in court. And yet the jury saw the clear truth. In June 2011, Levi Bellfield was found guilty of Milly Dowler's abduction, rape and murder. For this crime, he received another whole life order. Judges made it plain he would never walk free, and he would never again breathe air as anything other than a prisoner. And yet the conviction carried little solace. For Milly's family, there was no happy ending, no justice strong enough to match the enormity of the loss. What remained was knowledge that the man who lived just yards away from her final steps, the man police might have caught in those early days, had been free to kill again. The failure to see him for what he was, when the evidence sat almost literally on their doorstep, was a wound that would never quite heal. His daughter, Bobby Louise, also fears that Levi took her to the murder scene after Milly's disappearance in 2002. They went to his then Walton-on-Thames flat late at night. This was while Milly's missing posters hung all over the area. During their visit to the flat, Bellfield tried to get his daughter to break in through the letterbox. When she refused, he broke in himself using a coat hanger. He disappeared into the bedroom, but when she tried to follow him, he shut her out. She said he would never normally shout at me, but that night he was shouting at me to get out of the room. He was on edge and I was scared, thinking, why would he do that? There was something in there he was hiding, you could tell. At the time, I didn't think he had Milly in there. But now I do think that. Ms. Bellfield added, I feel very angry. I hate him that much. I feel sick to my stomach that someone could do that to a human being. I've cried myself to sleep. She was only a few years older than me. How terrified must she have been? But prison did not silence Levi Bellfield. If anything, confinement gave him a new stage upon which to perform. Cut off from the streets that he once prowled, he reinvented himself behind the walls of Franklin Prison in County Durham. He converted to Islam and renamed himself Yusuf Rahim. But the new name and the new religion did not signal redemption. Instead, it became another means of control, a way to cast himself in the role of the enigmatic, untouchable figure who could keep the outside world guessing. From his cell, he began to weave elaborate webs of confession and denial. At times he admitted to crimes, at other times he denied them with righteous indignation. He played with investigators, journalists, and even the families of the missing. He would drop hints, he'd send letters, or he would summon officials to hear what he called his truth. One week he would claim that he'd killed before Milly Dowler, and then the next week he would retract it. The pattern became familiar. He would say just enough to ignite a storm of speculation, and then he would pull back in silence and let that torment the people who were desperate for answers. Some psychologists would comment that this was the typical behaviour of a narcissist. Among the names that he attached himself to were some of Britain's most notorious unsolved cases. He said he'd abducted and murdered 19-year-old Elizabeth Chow. She was a student who'd vanished without trace from Ealing in 1999. He claimed involvement with the murder of 51-year-old Judith Gold, who was battered to death with a hammer outside her home in North London in 1990. Most shockingly, he also confessed to murdering Lynn and Megan Russell. Now, this was a mother and daughter who were bludgeoned to death in a frenzied hammer attack in Kent in 1996. But it was a case for which a man called Michael Stone had already been convicted and imprisoned. Now, each time police responded with caution. They reopened files and retraced evidence, and they searched for any corroboration they could find for the claims that Bellfield was making. But what they found were inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright impossibilities. Bellfield placed himself in the wrong towns, described attacks with the wrong hand, or gave details that did not align with established facts. And forensic reviews showed no trace of his involvement. In the end, detectives concluded that his confessions were in fact lies. They were calculated fabrications which were designed not to clear his conscience, but to inflict fresh agony on the families, sow doubt in the justice system, and to court attention for himself without regard to any damage it might cause. To those who studied him, it was another expression of his pathology. In the outside world, Bellfield had controlled women through intimidation, violence, and fear. In prison, with no direct victims to manipulate, he found new targets. And these were grieving parents, overworked detectives, and a public that was horrified by the prospect of more lives that had been lost to him. Every false confession gave him more relevance in his eyes. Every headline with his name on it was, for him, another victory. For the families, though, it was cruelty without purpose. Elizabeth Chow's relatives, who had waited decades for some answers, described the renewed hope that Bellfield's claims had given them. But this hope would just collapse again when the police dismissed his claims. The Russell family, too, were dragged back into a nightmare. They were forced to relive the horror of Lynn and Megan's murders in the media. But in the end, experts revealed that Bellfield's claims were completely implausible. Eventually, detectives learned to treat his stories as they treated the man himself. Dangerous. Bellfield's lies had bought him what he always craved, more attention. In the end, Bellfield emerges not as a mystery, but as a bleak study in how darkness can fester when left unchecked. His life was a patchwork of fractured beginnings and corrupted impulses. The bullied boy who was mocked for his weakness, the son who clung too tightly to a mother who could not bear to discipline him, and the teenager who learned to escape responsibility by using charm and lies. Out of that soil grew a man consumed by entitlement. Entitlement to women's bodies, to power, and to the final word in every situation. In the beginning, he never commanded fear. He was slight, awkward and unimposing in stature. But this very inadequacy became the fuel of his violence. He learned that where presence and charisma failed, coercion and cruelty could succeed. So after a growth spurt took him to 6 feet in height, the result was a man who demanded submission from those around him. His relationship with Joanna Collins revealed the full extent of this need. Stalking, surveillance, rape and psychological torture, and beyond her a trail of women, partners and victims alike, who lived in fear of his sudden eruptions. What defined Bellfield the most was his obsession. Blonde women became his fixation, scapegoats for his resentments and avatars for every insult he'd carried since childhood. He stalked them in his van, hunted them at bus stops, and then erased them with the swing of a hammer. The pattern was chilling in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. He turned the most ordinary of British suburban landscapes, quiet streets, bus routes, green commons, into crime scenes haunted by the randomness of his violence. Even after justice caught him, the manipulation did not stop, and he ensured that his name continued to poison the headlines. Now confined to 2 life orders, Bellfield is more than just a killer serving out his days. He is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignored warning signs, the bullied boy who was never corrected, the abuser whose patterns were dismissed as domestic troubles, the predator whose home, 100 yards from Milly Dowler's last steps, was never checked. His life embodies what happens when cruelty is underestimated, and when small violences are overlooked until they coalesce into murder. Levi Bellfield stands as both horror and warning. Horror in the sheer brutality of his crimes, and warning in the lessons his story carries. He is proof that evil does not always appear as a monster in the shadows. It can wear the face of the neighbour who cracks jokes, the doorman at the nightclub, or the man in the van circling near a bus stop. Initially charming and warm, yet insecure and devastatingly destructive, he leaves behind a legacy of grief and broken lives. It's a reminder, etched into the streets of London and Surrey, of how easily ordinary places can be transformed by extraordinary violence. Bobby Louise, his daughter, spoke for so many across the UK. She said, "I hope he rots in hell." Our condolences go out to the family and friends of all of the victims of Levi Bellfield. The only solace we can take is that this man will never walk free again. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe, and thank you for watching.